Someone doing something with this camera? Should probably put another flat back there in front of it. Any more for that?
No, I'm not going to play.
Oh, they don't have it.
You want to turn it around the other way? Yeah, we could back up.
Okay.
We can stick a ladder in the corner when we're done with it. Alright, so who's doing audio?
No, what's that, me?
I've got it written down. I think it's no.
That was the generator.
Want me to go look in my book? Or do you care?
No, well, just check it out.
Well, we can, I can start doing that.
Yeah, once you do that, and then work on mine. So do you think you want to be included?
No, I know I shouldn't.
Who's one good piece?
What's that? For strangling people?
For strangling people.
Where's the garbage?
Mental incapacity sounds serious.
Oh, yeah. So I'm filling in.
Well, you have the right life for it.
Wait, what?
For filling in.
I don't get it.
It's much less painful.
Charlie? Charlie Kelly? Charlie Kelly.
Charlie Kelly.
He's not here.
Not here?
It's a phone call from him.
He's showing time.
Is he not around?
Somebody else will talk to him.
An Omni? Whatever we can get at this point. I don't know if they have something to hang out. Wanda, what are you doing for audio?
Just as a cameraman. Want to do some fancy audio?
Fancy audio?
Yeah.
Not really.
Excuse me.
Down to, that's right, you were going to go to that place on Island? They have a 4 times the size. Really? Well, Lightning Bridge went about half, so they only went. Some guy, you know, they used to have the white space, and a few pedestal black and whites. This is just to record, or they're online with they broadcast? No.
Due to technical difficulties, we will be joining this edition of Dead Air Live 10 minutes into the broadcast. The topic of this show is Socialism in Somerville. The 3 studio guests are Carl Canetta, who lives in Somerville and works in a publishing collective called the South End Press. Secondly, Marianne Cefalo, who has lived most of her life in Somerville and has worked for the rights of welfare mothers, for Vista, and also for the Elizabeth Peabody House. And thirdly, Antonio Silva, who is being introduced by the host as we join the show.
Just got a cue from the floor manager that we have a tape to go to now. This is a tape of a man named Antonio Silva, who's lived in Somerville for several years. Some of you may know him. He repairs flutes on Medford Avenue. And This is Mr. Silva in his shop. He's been a socialist for most of his life, and he's 93 years old now and still going strong. So we'd like you to meet Mr. Silva, and after the tape, he's going to come on the show.
Drafted, would you have gone, or would you have been a draft resistor?
Well, that's probably I would have got to that point. I would have been a draft resistor.
Were there a lot of resistors back then? Against
Well, it was. They called it. Now, you had to have a card. I don't know.
conscientious
I know you could
objectors?
explain. You had to have a card that you had to carry. And every once in a while, the thing was new at that time. They didn't know what to do with themselves, really.
Right.
So the whole thing was new, and they were making makeshift. So every once in a while they would pounce in a district, yes, a residential district. They'd get on a main street and then round up everybody that they met, see if they had the card. See if you had your card with you. If you didn't, they'd take you to the police station. See?
Oh, I see. So you had to.
They were doing that. That was the First World War, but I don't think they would do that now. It was too cumbersome. Too much.
Was there a lot of labor unrest around that time, in terms of riots of any?
Oh yeah,
Did you ever see any of those?
the mine workers, the steel workers, the Pullman strike. You ever hear the Pullman?
Yeah, I heard of that.
Yeah.
The
There was
railroad work.
very much labor disturbance.
And there was the Palmer raids. Do you remember them?
Yeah, sure, the Palmer raids. Well, that's what I'm talking about. And they used to go into the meetings, into halls where the parties met. Unexpectedly, they'd raid a place like that.
And they'd arrest
And they'd
everyone.
go into the the headquarters of the Socialist Party, Socialist Labour Party, Communist Party. They'd go in there and they'd smash everything. They'd smash everything up in those places.
How about the Ludlow massacre? Do you remember that?
The what?
The Ludlow massacre, when some strikers, I guess, a lot
Oh,
of strikers were
yeah,
killed.
yeah.
And
And
Lawrence.
then Lawrence and Lowell, they had that's where Gurley Flynn,
Right.
yeah. Besides others, I can't remember the name of them all. But Gurley Flynn was very active in the movement. That was the textile. That was the
right.
textiles trouble. That
I
was
guess
Manchester, New Hampshire, Lowell, Lawrence, and other places. And in Rhode Island, they had factories like Lonsdale, Pawtucket. They had mills all over the place. River Point, and all through Connecticut. They had mills scattered all over the place.
was the,
Welcome back to Dead Air Live. We're in the studio now, and Mr. Silva, who you just saw in his shop, is now here with us live. Mr. Silva, you're a very impressive person to be going so hard and strong at 93. And I hear that you've been very, very active as a socialist all your life.
Well, that's late years.
Can you tell us how you first got into socialism?
Oh, well, I was working in Brown Shop as an apprentice, and I met two or more persons that was social. One was the Socialist Labour Party, and they started to tell me a few things. And coming from the farm, I was receptive because, and so I listened, and they gave me some literature, and I read, and that's how I got interested.
And what was your first activity as a socialist?
Well, I joined the Socialist Labor Party,
And what year was this?
1911, I guess, or 10, 11,
So you must have been active during World War I.
right?
What stand did the socialists take in this country during World War I?
Well, they took us against the war.
Against the war.
Right, the First World War, that's what you were talking about, yeah.
Yes, so what activity did you take against the war? What did you do?
Well, we organized meetings, and of course you had to be careful. You you had to be very careful you wouldn't get arrested. In fact, well, I was the age of that I could be drafted. So they issued cards at that time. You had to carry that card in your pocket all the time. And they could pick you up any place. In fact, they would pick out some locality in Providence, and would raid that particular spot, and grab anyone that wanted to see that draft card. If you didn't have it, they'd take you to the police station.
That must have been a very hard position to take in World War I. It was pretty unpopular, wasn't it, to be against the war?
Well, in World War I, you see, most people were sympathetic to the Germans. And it took some time to change that attitude to favor the English, which were the side we were on at that time. Mm-hmm. It took some doing to change the mind of the people, because German, we had fought the Revolutionary War against England in the war 1812, and the sympathy was favoring Germany. Mm-hmm. Now, to go to war to Germany, you had to change the attitude. So that's what was taking place during this period that I'm talking about. Gosh, I forgot, 1912 was it, or I don't know just the date.
Mm-hmm. Well, Carl, you were telling me that you got involved in socialism also through more of a mass movement. Was that the Vietnam War? Is that? Yes. So both of you men came in through being draft age,
Different periods,
I presume. Can you tell us how you moved along the path towards socialism, Carl?
Well, as you noted, it started during the Vietnam War era, which was a time of tremendous upheaval. A lot of people asking or beginning to ask very hard questions about the way the world was, and if we had to accept the way things were. And by the time I went to college here in Boston, I was opposed to the war, though I was not active on a day-to-day basis. And it's kind of interesting because there was quite a bit of anti-war activity building at the time. This is 1968. And what finally pushed me over from being a supporter to being an activist was when I was taking a walk with my dog, actually. And I walked into one of the small demonstrations. These would happen almost on a daily basis. And just as I was approaching the demonstration, police moved in to break it up. They had stopped traffic on Commonwealth Avenue. And I was standing on the sidewalk watching this, and I was amazed at the brutality that was being exercised there. It took me by surprise. I still had certain illusions about how power is exercised. And I saw somebody about my age being beaten to the ground. And the officer who was doing it turned toward me and just stared at me for a second. And in that instant, I realized that it didn't matter. It really didn't matter, you know, where I stood exactly. I was, in the eyes of that officer, you know, I could have been the next victim in that sense. And that began my thinking about the need to alter power relations and to do away with a situation where so much power can be held and used to stop. I mean, when you think about it, a movement that now many or most people believe was justified, that the war was not right, that it should have been stopped, that we should never have been involved, and many of the people who tried to get that point across at the time were beaten, arrested, and that began me moving and becoming involved and believing that you know, I had to try to take power back into my own hands with other people collectively. Mm-hmm. So that was war. I think is perhaps the most outlandish abuse of our current social order, and I think that's why so many people during a period of war begin to question whether it really is worthwhile. You know, if we really are fighting for the ideals that we hold as individuals, or if somebody else is determining, you know, what the war is about, mm-hmm. and then sending us to fight.
Mm-hmm. This is very interesting to me to see how much in common the three of you have, because the two of you were involved in anti-war movements that related to foreign wars, and you were fighting at home for the rights of women, for the rights of children, and for the rights of elderly people. And all of you in this time of finding the enemy decided to change the ideas that you'd had and redefine who had the power and whether they rightfully had the power.
One thing I would like to interject here, though, is I don't have any affiliation with the socialist labor movement, nor do I wish to. I don't condemn it, but it's not part of my life.
Right.
I strictly did it as maybe a radical. Mm-hmm. You know, I found myself in a bad situation, my neighbor's in a bad situation, and I did it, you know, I tried to affect change as an American citizen.
Right, and you told me before you came on the show very clearly that you came on as a private citizen and you had been active in causes that you felt were very important, and it was not party affiliated. Mm-hmm. And one of the reasons that we wanted you on this show was because so much of what you'd done followed along the kinds of lines that we were all concerned with.
I can appreciate
right.
that, and I'm not unhappy at all about some of the changes that affected. I'm just a little bit unhappy about the limbo that things are in Somerville right now.
Right.
You know.
Well, speaking of Somerville, we have another tape that we're going to go to, and these are on-street interviews. These are interviews with people done at Porter Square 2 weeks ago, asking them what do they think, asking these people on the street, what is socialism? Is there any difference between socialism and communism in your mind? And so forth. And is there any value to socialism? So if you watch now, you'll see maybe some of your neighbors answering that question.
Yeah.
We just want to know your feelings about socialism.
Well, I don't like it. I don't want it.
Why don't you like it?
Because I like the way our country is run right now.
We just want to know what you think about socialism, and do you think it's a viable alternative?
Sure.
Why?
It's great. Well, I think there's a lot of, oh, Kelly, this is a hard question. Because I think the system is really unfair to a lot of people, and this could bring about a fairer system, more equality for everybody, like something like health care. Mm-hmm. For example, I was at the doctor this morning, cost me $25 to talk to him for 5 minutes.
I don't like socialism.
How come?
Because it's partly government controlled, and I don't believe in that.
I don't really know what socialism is.
So, yeah, I think it'd be great. I'm not real optimistic about it happening in this country during my life. I don't see it as I don't think you could run a party on it and get anywhere unless the economy got much, much worse.
Well, I can see that the Social Democrats in Europe have done some good things.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's as far as I could take it.
How do you think socialism could be applied in this country now?
Well, very difficult. I mean, the two-party system really doesn't allow it.
Why does that not allow it?
Well, because, you see, the thing is, the two-party system, as I understand it, incorporates, you know, all these things in other words, the major parties incorporate the social programs as part of a large platform, and the election laws don't really allow fragmentation of parties. So people end up having to make deals within the parties in order to get things done, rather than make deals within, you know, between, you know, factions.
That in England there's a left and a right, but in the States there's a right and there's a centre, and therefore it's much harder to put across ideas that affect everybody over here, just for the simple reason that no one over here wants to be called red or red-baited, whereas in England there is a national health program which is coming under fire, but those sorts of ideas are much more readily accepted.
So how do you think something like socialism could be viable in this country? How would we go about it?
I don't know. There are some very good things about the States, such as wanting people to stand on their own feet, to be independent, and I think the question is to get the right mix of that, and with people who cannot cope so well. I think in England there is a problem of people investing too much in a belief in a community on a large scale, which I think has its problems, and tends to fall under bureaucracy, as any large-scale organization will. And in many ways there are more freedoms over here.
I'm sure there are drawbacks in socialism. Socialism is also a very wide term. I mean, there's all different kinds of it. So I think that it's experimental, and I think that it's been experimented through different countries, and it would be very, very different here than any other socialist country.
So do you think it is a viable alternative?
Absolutely, no doubt about it.
Why?
Well, I'm not even from this country, so it's difficult for me to talk about it in terms of the States, but I can only say, you know, that I can't see any other alternative. There's a lot of people in socialist parties in Denmark. There are socialist parties who are part of parliament and everything in Denmark. You don't have that here. A lot of I think the left is much stronger in Denmark than it is here, much more visible. I wouldn't say stronger, it's more visible in Denmark, and has a little bit more access to the media and has a more visible impact on society.
What kind of impact is it?
Well, I mean, it's concerning laws, because they're in parliament, it makes a lot of what the system's about more visible, because they can bring out the scandals, they can bring out the power plays going on, they have more access to material, to who's who and why. They can affect passing of laws which will hurt people, or try to pass new laws which will benefit, and you know, and that's very generally said, but you know.
I have heard of socialism is practiced in Sweden, and it seems as though it's had some very beneficial effects. For example, I've heard that no one is poor in Sweden, no one starves or goes hungry or goes without work. If that could be done in this country, it would be a fantastic thing. I don't know whether Americans as a people are ready to accept socialist ideology that would allow that to be done.
Why not?
I think people are these days still tied to you know, a basically egoistic or individualistic conception of people's social relationships and, you know, and economic relationships. The entrepreneur making it big in the free capitalist system, rather than what I take to be maybe a more realistic view of people relying on each other and depending on each other for their economic livelihood. So,
why do you think people fear socialism, even though a majority of people don't seem to know what it is?
Because it's something different than what we have in this country. And usually people are afraid of what they don't understand, and most people don't understand it. So that's why they're afraid of it.
Why do you think people fear socialism?
I think they don't understand it, and I think the history in the States of McCarthyism, Vietnam, that people still remember being listed. I know people over here who've been listed, and in England there's never been that problem, and even where you have communist parties that are fairly strong in France and in Italy, there's not that same fear.
People aren't able to distinguish socialism from Russian totalitarianism. They're afraid that any sort of move towards socialism would involve dictatorships and loss of personal freedom.
Losing what they have, losing their own, their own little piece of land or whatever they have, and giving it up and thinking that they have to share everything and nothing's going to be theirs anymore.
Right. You think that's real?
I think for the very rich it's real. I think for the majority of the people it's not real at all. I think everybody will have a lot more.
I think a lot of people tend to be afraid of socialism because of associations that have been made by opponents of socialism between socialism and communism. Communism is practiced in the Soviet Union, maybe.
Well, I think that the majority of people are satisfied with a style of government or something that they've grown up with and their parents have grown up with, and I think that out of habit they think in terms of democracy being superior, or just not pursuing alternatives in a general sort of way. I think that it's not the average individual who thinks about alternatives.
To go out to the left to be socialist is a bugbear in itself, and is attackable just for saying, well, I think such and such, or I believe such and such. It's too much against the American dream.
Welcome back. We've moved from Porter Square back into the present. And if you're watching this show on Tuesday, the 10th of August, you're seeing this show live. If you're watching it on Tuesday, the 10th of August, you can call in. And our number is 628-6750. I would like to hear from you what you thought about those people who are your neighbors, their opinions of socialism. And I'd like our guests in the studio to react to that tape and talk about if you think that was a representative group of people, if those are the kind of reactions you come across normally, or what. Before we jump right into that, I want to tell you that we did a little bit of research for this show. We tried to find out about the socialist roots in Somerville and what kind of activities had gone on in Somerville over the years. And the history that we found out was pretty sketchy. Now, it may have been that we didn't spend enough time at it, but we did find out that there had been some very, very active people in the early part of this century, and that Somerville Avenue had been lined with factories and a lot of people who were very interested in socialism. And if you're an older person, maybe you could call us in and tell us about those days, because we'd like to hear more about it. Maybe you can tell us about the strike that the tube workers had, or maybe you can tell us about the Italian anarchists who hung out at the Mansfield Street Club, because we'd like to know as much about that as we can. Apparently, the meat packers in Somerville were the strongest union from what we've been able to find out. And people all since the beginning of this century in Somerville have been acting out socialist principles and trying to change their lives, trying to change the workplace, the conditions that they worked under, and the distribution of wealth. But we want to know what you know about socialism, and if you didn't get asked at Porter Square, now's your chance to call in. So the number is 628-6750. Carl, what did you think of those answers that people gave about socialism? Did that seem typical to you?
I think that, I don't know if the balance was quite the same as you'd find everywhere and at all times, but I think that people were hitting on the simple fact that the definition of socialism changes for different people, and raising the question about who defines what socialism is. I'm a socialist, but for the United States, I don't define what socialism is. Maybe Roger Mudd does. Maybe the newscasters do. The people who have control of the newspapers may define what socialism is, and it's almost universally defined as something that's very bad. I've often felt from people that, or I've gotten the response from people that I must be a little bit crazy to be a socialist, and I must be certainly crazy to admit that I was a socialist. But then I talk about what it means to my life and give them an example from my own life, for instance, where I work, and talk about people who work also controlling their place of work. And a lot of people find that to be an attractive thing, because in our democratic country, democracy ends at the factory doors, for instance. I mean, that's just one.
Okay, that's a phrase I've heard many times. And working in the publishing business may seem a little removed and esoteric to a lot of people who are watching the show. Say you worked in a factory. Say you worked down at the Schraff's factory or any factory in Somerville or in the surrounding area that Somerville people might work in. If you were working under socialist principles, what would life be like in a factory?
That's me. Well, this is very speculative for me because I've never worked in a very large factory. I think first of all, the production decisions would be made collectively, which doesn't necessarily mean that 10,000 people gathered together in a room and try to come to a decision, but that in a sense, you apply some of the principles of democracy that we're all taught to the factory setting. You elect representatives, you make decisions about what you want to produce, how much you want to produce, how much you want to pay yourselves, how much you want to put into investment. Maybe you join in these decisions with other factories. So in that sense, the people who work on the line share in the decisions that affect their lives. I think one thing it could also change would be that clearly people who work on the line are going to be more concerned with their own safety. I mean, we have in this nation 11,000 people dying every year on the shop floor, and tens of thousands dying from work-related illnesses every year. There's a lot of technology that could be applied, but people have to fight tooth and nail to have it applied. In a situation where workers controlled their own factory, clearly people are going to take steps to protect their own health. That would be one instance.
Mm-hmm. What about care for children? What about daycare?
Right. Well, I think that especially in the circumstances in this country at this time, where you have a lot of single mothers working and having to take care of their children or make special expenses for that. Clearly, child care would be extremely important, and in a socialist America, that would be considered a right. It wouldn't be considered a privilege. I mean, that would be things like health care. I think that you would probably have very strong agreement from many people in the country that we do need a comprehensive national health care system of some sort, something that is much more responsive to people's needs. In a socialist America, that would be a right. Certainly, people's health, I believe, is a right. In a nation where we can put people on the moon, we should be able to provide decent health care to all people.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that would be another example.
I think we have it. I really do. I mean, I've been on welfare, and I've had Medicaid, and as much as I resented being on welfare and the intimidated feelings by it, it's like kind of being parented all over again.
Mm-hmm.
I was very grateful for the chance to be with my children during their early years.
Mm-hmm.
And they were covered from head to toe medically.
Great.
And I really, I don't see that as a problem. I see nationally, I'd like to see a national health program because of the balance of payments. I think that doctors and hospitals have gone crazy with the budget, since Medicaid's been introduced and there's vendor payments. All of a sudden, hospitals are $250 a day for a slummy looking room. I think that needs to be addressed, but basically I am grateful for the health care that my children have received, and I know millions of children have
Did
received.
they receive it only when you were on welfare? Or do they still receive it now?
Well, through work relations, they're covered medically.
Right. You were telling me about when you were investigating the living situation of elderly people in Somerville earlier on, before the show we were talking. And you were telling me stories about old people living in conditions that were horrific. Now, I would think that if you were going to talk about a future that you would like to see, I would speculate that it would include better care for elderly people. Would you like to talk a little bit about that?
Basically, they called it...
Excuse me, we have a long distance call. That hardly ever happens, so I'll have to take that now. I'd punch in one. Okay. Hello, this is, you're on live now on Dead Air Live. Uh-huh. Excuse me just a minute, I haven't got you coming on into the studio now. How do I do that? I have to hang it up? I hang this up now? What, I put this down? Hello?
Okay.
Oh, great. Now we can hear you. Can you say that again?
Okay, I just was remarking that I've been watching the show and finding it interesting, and seeing that people who are older than, 20 have been involved in these ideas and socialism and things. And, that it didn't just start with Vietnam or, hippies or whatever. And it's just it's kind of interesting to see all the people there in Fortress Square talking about it. And what I was just wondering, given the way the economy is running and unemployment, and the woman especially speaking about the troubles that she's had in her life, and I know that kind of thing still goes on in Somerville and lots of other cities as well. It almost seems like, instead of being a non-patriotic thing to be asking questions about socialist ideas, it might be a patriotic one, and questions about what's fair and what's not fair in these days. So if people wanted to find out about socialist ideas like the people on your show did from other people, where would they go to find out more about the ideas of and the economical ideas and all that sort of thing?
Well, that's an excellent question.
I mean, in Somerville or just in general, I know that one of the people there publishes books and that sort of thing, but where can other people get started with some of these ideas the way they did?
If you don't mind, I'd like to tell you how I got introduced into it.
Okay.
I was living in public housing after a long struggle. I became involved with the tenants group. From there, I became involved with Vista and became a Vista volunteer. Mm-hmm. And when I saw the changes that came about just through Vista being involved in the community, and it meant I had to do a lot of door knocking. I had to leave my son to babysitters while I did this door knocking and outreach, and I was discouraged, but I found out the harder you knock, the more you knock, finally somebody's going to listen to you. And the end result was in Somerville that we got furniture grants. We got, for pregnant women, prior to delivering a baby, the best you could hope for was general relief, which was a pittance. You couldn't live on it. You had no thing for your baby, so through that we got layettes for prospective mothers. When their baby was born, there was a layette, there was bottles, diapers, the crib through the furniture grant. And I saw all these marvelous things happening, and people's dignity being restored. Somebody was out there getting them motivated. And once, it's hard. People sit back and wait for somebody to carry the flag in front of them. Mm-hmm. So if there's any shots fired, you're going to get it, not them. But after the initial attempts to help better your life, they got very involved in it. We even had the mayor of Somerville and the aldermen and everybody involved in a Halloween party in the housing project, and had a very happy, safe Halloween.
So you got onto socialism by becoming more active.
Well, I can't call it socialism.
Right.
I don't feel comfortable saying that because...
And I apologize.
Yeah, I'm not upset with you for that, but it's just my own identity, I feel kind of like when Ben Franklin and all of them got together and said, hey, something's really wrong here. We have to do something. Just as a citizen, you know, as a community person. The caring has to go beyond your coffee table, beyond your door. You know, one neighbor concerned for another. You know, I had so many coffee clutches that I could pull my hair out. And I said, we're not solving anything here. We're just getting agita from the coffee, you know.
We have another call now, and I want to make sure that this gentleman has a specific answer to his question. One way that I found out some information is by looking up in the telephone book. There's a listing called Democratic Socialist Organizing Committee, and that's in the Boston telephone book. There's also the Socialist Workers' Party listed in the telephone book, although I didn't ever get an